Professor Trenton Holliday, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup all the way from your office in New Orleans, Louisiana. You are a paleoanthropologist and professor of anthropology at Tulane University in New Orleans. You are also the author of Cro-Magnon, the story of the last Ice Age people of Europe. And it's the Cro-Magnons, or Cro-Magnons, also known as European early modern humans, that we'll be focusing on today. So, how are you doing, Trenton? You've just come back from France as part of your ongoing research on prehistoric European humans. That must have been an interesting experience.
Yeah, I was in France. I was only in France for about a week. I did meet with collaborators, colleagues with whom I've worked for years. But my primary purpose for being in France is I was at the Société d'Anthropologie de Paris meetings, which this year were held in Bordeaux. I was invited to give the keynote address at the end of the conference. So, and actually, if we have any Francophone viewers out there, that lecture should be up on the Bibliothèque de Bordeaux website before too long. And maybe by the time this is on the air. They haven't put it up yet, but the recording will be available if you speak French. You might enjoy it.
Before we step back into the world of our most recent prehistoric ancestors, the Cro-Magnons, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Trent, did you always have an interest in science and in particular, human origins?
I have always been interested in science. I was particularly interested in fossils. So I would spend hours as a kid on gravel driveways looking for fossils. Crinoid stems were a particular favorite fossil of mine to discover. I grew up in South Louisiana. There are no rocks in the alluvial plain of South Louisiana. They had to be brought in. So it's not like I could go scampering up a rock escarpment somewhere looking for fossils. I had to look at rocks that were brought in. Um, I was really into dinosaurs as a kid, as a very young child, and I actually considered becoming a dinosaur paleontologist. But I was also interested in human evolution. And among the earliest memories I have about human evolution is the discovery of Lucy. My mother told me about the discovery of Lucy in 1974 when I was about 8 years old. And I was fascinated by the notion of prehistoric humans, ancient humans, and especially human evolution. I ended up going to university in Louisiana at Louisiana State University. I thought a bit about going into geology, but landed in anthropology and loved it. Was interested in both archaeology and biological anthropology, ultimately pursuing a PhD in biological anthropology at the University of New Mexico. I worked with Professor Eric Trinkus, who's a Neanderthal expert, was interested in Neandertals, still love Neandertals. They're in the book. They're an important part of the Cro-Magnon story as I see it. My dissertation research was on modern human origins, the origins of our species, Homo sapiens, it and the fate of the Neanderthals and how that's all tied up together. Largely, I've worked in Europe. So for my dissertation, I collected data from museums. I basically went around to museums, mostly in Europe, also in the Levant or the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, looking at fossil hominins, taking measurements of them. I actually had a portable X-ray machine, so I took radiographs of the limb bones of these individuals as well. I was interested in phylogenetics or evolutionary history of modern humans, but I was also interested in some functional aspects, what we can learn about their behavior over time. And I've mostly focused in Europe. I've done archaeological excavations in Portugal and in southwestern France. Those are two areas where I love to work. I was also invited to work with the team in South Africa, working on Australopithecus sediba and then Homo naledi. So those two South African species, relatively recently named species. Was happy to be a part of that big team, a collaborative group of people working on a fascinating amount of fossils from southern Africa. But I always come back to Europe. I love the late Pleistocene, the last ice age, potential interactions between Neanderthals and early modern humans. And so that's what my book is about. And that's what you and I are going to spend time talking about today.
Well, many have heard the name Cro-Magnons, now commonly referred to as European early modern humans. But despite their recent ancestry with all of us, people may not know the details of what we've discovered about them. Trent, can you give our audience an overview of this group, how they were discovered, and what we currently know about them?
Sure. So in the mid 19th century, there really was no notion of human prehistory. Um, People thought that all history had been written down in the book of Genesis, for example, all the begat chapters of Genesis. And so the notion that there were humans before there was such a thing as a written record was considered false. And in 1859, according to Arnaud Urel, who's a French historian of science, that changed. And what was big about 1859, you might think, well, it's Darwin's book, which did come out that year, but actually there were two other things that happened earlier in 1859 that were really significant. One is that they documented at multiple sites in controlled excavation circumstances the presence of humanly made artifacts, clearly humanly made artifacts, either art or weaponry, tools, other kinds of tools associated with extinct animals, ice age animals. And so this established that humans were present in prehistory. The second was at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meetings, which were held in Aberdeen, Scotland. Charles Lyell, the father of uniformitarianism, very important geologist who gave us sort of the notion of a very deep time for the age of the Earth. He came out in 1859, I believe it's September of 1859, saying that he actually accepted early prehistoric humans. And so that was a sea change for the science to have someone of his stature come out and say this. And November, Darwin's book comes out. And so we have Darwin avoided talking about human evolution in that first book. I mean, there was only one sentence in which he said, much light will be shed on man and his history. But it was a sea change in the sense that people accepted that humans were here before history. So that's 1859. In 1866, in the little town of Les Aziz in southwestern France in the Dordogne region, they're building a railroad, and the railroad runs from Agen to Limoges. And at some point, they decide they need to build a new train station for this railroad for the town of Les Aziz. And in order to build the train station, they need to build a road to the train station. And there are a bunch of rock shelters. I don't know. Les Aziz is sometimes called the capital of prehistory. So many of your viewers may be familiar with the town. It's so many archaeological sites and paleontological sites surrounding this little village in southwestern France. But they have to blast through some of this material, and there are these rock shelters that are full of sediments. Archaeological sites tend to be sediment traps because if sediments are washing out, artifacts are washing out as well. And they're using dynamite to blast what was known as the Cro-Magnon shelter. Cro is an Occitan word, which is a Romance language that was widely spoken across southern France, a little tiny bit of Italy, and then Catalonia as well. That language is actually enjoying a bit of a renaissance at this point in time. Cro means hollow, and then Magnon was the property owner. So they're blasting material out, and they find human remains associated with reindeer who no longer live in France. So it gives an idea that this is from the last ice age, and pierced shells, pierced teeth, stone tools. So it was the first time that they had documented Homo sapiens skeletons that were recognized as being prehistoric. Now, of course, there was controversy. humans had been found, Homo sapiens skeletons had been found earlier. At Paviland in Wales, there was a skeleton of an adolescent male that was erroneously thought to be a woman of ill repute that had followed a Roman encampment that was found nearby. It turns out that this was, about a 30,000-year-old Upper Paleolithic or Stone Age, early Stone Age human being, but it wasn't recognized as being prehistoric. So Cro-Magnon, the actual site of Cro-Magnon, which is just in Les Azes, there's actually a hotel there called the Hotel Cro-Magnon. That site was discovered by accident. They brought in an expert, Louis Lartet. A lot of the site had been destroyed before he got there, but they had found the remains of several individuals, including Cro-Magnon 1, the so-called old man of Cro-Magnon, Cro-Magnon 2, who's a female, presumed female, and then a neonate. It turns out in recent years, some people have gone back to the material. They think there were at least 3 neonatal skeletons present. I mean, all this material was removed under less than ideal circumstances, but there was enough there. There were multiple sediments on top of this occupation layer that it really did establish that these were truly prehistoric humans associated with this. Now, that's in Europe. Europe, humans are relatively late showing up, or Homo sapiens is relatively late showing up in Europe. The earliest sort of secure dates we have for Homo sapiens in Europe are about 54,000 years ago, which suggests either there's some kind of ecological reason they're not getting into Europe that early, or perhaps it's competition from Neanderthals that are kind of entrenched, and maybe some combination of both. But the earliest modern humans, and I use modern humans as sort of a vernacular way of saying Homo sapiens. So the earliest Homo sapiens are actually found in Africa. I actually have a cast of one of them, so I'll show you like a prop. So this is a cast of Jebeler Hood, which currently has the record for earliest Homo sapiens specimen at about 300,000 years old. Now, the brain case is a little long and lower. Ours tend to be more globular. And Mark, you and I can show off our brain cases more than the average Joe, perhaps. But there's long and low cranium, not terribly modern or globular. But what's key is the face. It's a very small face. It's a non-projecting face. And it has this feature here called the canine fossa, which is a little furrow that modern humans have, and it tends to show up in non-projecting faces. You do see it occasionally in some earlier archaic or non-modern fossils. The Liang-Bois specimen, the type specimen of Homo floresiensis, the Hobbit, has one of these. We see it occasionally, sometimes in the Middle Pleistocene of Europe, but sometimes we think there may be a post-mortem distortion that mimics it. But in any case, this is considered by many paleoanthropologists to be the earliest member of our species at about 300,000 years ago. And we have specimens from Homo kibish in Ethiopia that are very modern looking in their morphology. At least one in particular is very modern, about 233,000 years ago. We have a specimen from Herto or Idaltu, which is also in Ethiopia. It's about 150,000 years ago. So we have humans very early in Africa, just outside of Africa in the Levant, in the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. We have humans there at a site like Mislia Cave at 194,000 years ago or so. And we also have very important sites, School and Kafsa, where we have very modern or nearly modern looking humans at about 100,000, 120, 90,000 years ago. And then don't see them in Europe until about 54,000 years ago. This is a so-called early modern European. This is not Cro-Magnon, the Cro-Magnon specimen. This is from Mladich, which is a site in southern Moravia or the Czech Republic. It too has a nice canine fossa, pretty small nose, a relatively long and low cranium as well. This is Mladich 1, about 35,000 years old. Some of these specimens, these early modern Europeans, fall within the range of people today, and others lie outside of it. And for me, that's not too surprising. If something's 35,000 years ago or 35,000 years old, do we necessarily expect it to fit within the range of people today? So I'm fascinated by these early modern humans when they make it into Europe. Uh, they're coming into a continent that's already occupied by their relatives, the Neanderthals, and that's what my story. That's what the book is about. And that's again, I keep saying that's what we're talking about today. So hopefully, I haven't yammered on too long.
Trent, what do we know about the lifestyle of these early humans? We're talking tens of thousands of years ago rather than millions of years ago. So surely we've been able to find an appreciable amount of evidence as to their culture.
Yes, we have. So these are hunter gatherers, right? They live gathering plant foods and animals, hunting animals. Uh, Probably we have sort of been focused, and by we I would include archaeologists in that, on the fact that the large mammals. And part of this is because those are easy to see. But I think a bigger part is that that is a main constituent of their diet. So in Europe, south of the Alps, they're really focused on things like red deer, which is in North America we would refer to it as elk, be the same genus, not elk in the sense of how they say elk in British English. That would be a moose. So these are red deer. They also have they go after ibex or wild goats and aurochs, who are the ancestors of modern day domestic cattle. So these would be what you imagine a big bull to look like, only bigger. And in Europe, north of the Alps, they focus more on reindeer in some places, horses, bison, and mammoths. There's a whole culture of people in what is known colloquially as the Mammoth Steppe, which stretches from parts of southwestern Germany through what's now Austria, the Czech Republic, down into sort of Romania, and then across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia. There was this huge steppe, and by steppe I mean a very cold grassland, and that is the environment in which mammoths thrived. And some of these humans we know from extracting isotopes from their bodies, we know that they focused heavily on mammoths. And of course, at some of the sites, we see some of these sites, it's like 90% of the fauna are mammoths. There's a site where I've worked in the Czech Republic called Dolní Věstonice. It's just a few miles north of the Austrian border. It's a fascinating, it's actually a series of sites there at Dolní Věstonice. The first one that was found is Dolní Věstonice 1. It's around this giant hill. It's actually the westernmost Carpathian mountain, and you can see it on the landscape for miles. It's a Danube Valley, so it's really flat. And then there's this outcropping, this mountain called Paleve Hill, and around the base of Paleve Hill are a series of sites. Some are referred to as Dolní Věstonice, which is one of the cities or towns, I really should say, at the base. There's another series of sites called Pavlov, which is the neighboring town, but they're all lined up around this feature on the landscape. And at Dolní Věstonice in particular, this Dolní Věstonice 1 site, there are huts that are round to sort of oval in shape, and the base of the huts is made out of mammoth bone. And we can imagine it looks as if they're living there year round. So Dolní Věstonice is like a village. It's a village with hunter gatherers. They're pre-agriculturalists, and they're focused. Much of their focus is on mammoths and hunting of mammoths, which can't be an easy thing to do. So a pretty dangerous occupation. There's also been a revolution, though, in investigating plant remains that these hunter gatherers in Europe or at the last ice age are exploiting. There's been like what you would call mortar and pestle. They found it with a little bit of plant residue present still on the actual pestle for grinding, and it looks as if they were making flour, flour for basically what you might call breads that are being made. In some cases, the flour was made from seeds. In some cases, it seems to have been made from roots. And one particularly intriguing idea, at least I find it intriguing, is acorn flour. They've done studies. Now, in prehistoric North America, there are plenty of Native American groups in the ethnographic present who exploit acorns. And what they'll generally do is put them in a moving body of water that helps remove a lot of the tannins that give acorns a kind of a bitter taste. And then once you've sort of bleached them, gotten these tannins out, they've done experiments where they've made flour from acorns, and it's actually pretty good. I mean, the carbohydrates levels are pretty high, but it also has a high fat content. The fat content is said to be approximately what you would find in, say, olive oil. So, we do know that during the late Pleistocene, during the last ice age, a lot of their food has to come from animals. Plant foods aren't going to be available for much of the year. They may be able to eat the gut contents of some of their prey to get some of the plants that they need, some of the nutrients that they need from plants. But they are actually doing things like grinding flour and eating these vegetal remains that largely were invisible. And I don't blame my archaeological colleagues. It's hard to find evidence for plants, tiny seeds and the like. The big bones of things, especially something like a mammoth, that kind of catches one's attention, right? If you're at the site. So I think they're hunter gatherers. Maybe towards the end of the Pleistocene, towards the end of the Ice Age, they may have dabbled a little bit in domestication. It's hard to know, but they're living by collecting and hunting and trapping animals. Some of them appear to have been exploiting, based on isotopic analyses as well as archaeological remains, fish, freshwater fish, including anadromous fish, those fish that are like salmon that are born in fresh water and then go out and live their adult lives in the ocean and then come back to the place where they were born to spawn. That seems to have been something that some of these Cro-Magnon or early modern humans exploited as well. So, in terms of diet, it's a really rich, healthy diet that these folks are eating. The other thing I might want to mention about hunting is that it looks as if these early modern humans in Europe had projectile weapons. This is based on points that are present in the archaeological record. The points that we see in many cases have telltale damage that looks as if they had a high impact. They were used as a high impact projectile. And the other thing I want to mention is when I say projectile weapons, I'm talking about a long distance projectile. So we know that handheld spears in the ethnographic present are actually lobbed on occasion at animals. As a general rule, these are often called thrusting spears. You tend not to release your thrusting spear because if you miss the animal or fail to injure it in a great enough manner, now you don't have your spear and there's an angry animal who sees you as a threat. The earliest projectiles, based on size, and there is a large overlap in size between projectiles that are shot by bow, like arrows, and projectiles that are shot by a propulsor or an atlatl or a spear thrower. Mostly, I think, and I suspect this is the case, that these early modern humans in Europe are using a spear thrower or an atlatl, which is basically an extension of the arm, has a little spur in it, and then one has a dart that has a hole or a cavity at the base of the dart that fits into the spur, and then this becomes an extension of your arm so that you can throw that dart or that relatively lightweight spear with a lot more velocity and a lot more force. I tend to think that the bow and arrow was not used as much during the Ice Age of Europe because, and this is based largely on the work of Stephen Churchill, who's at Duke University. The bow and arrow has a shorter effective range. And the reason it has a shorter effective range is because it's a smaller projectile. And as a result, one needs to hit between, say, for example, ribs or avoid the scapula of game. And this can be a pretty small area. So because one has to aim it much more carefully, the bow and arrow is not a weapon of choice unless you can get very close to your prey. You may remember that I said there's this huge swath of Europe that's the mammoth steppe. A lot of Europe during the last ice age is either grassland or tundra. It's treeless or relatively treeless. And so the ability to sneak up on game and get close enough for the effective use of bow and arrow is probably not there. And so, based on the size of the projectiles that they have, and the fact that it's mostly an open or more open environment in Europe at the time, I suspect that most of these long distance projectiles are they're using an atlatl or a propulsor or a spear thrower, and we have those in the archaeological record for Europe. Some of my favorite artifacts are in fact these atlatls that are made from, say, reindeer antler. Just some beautiful, absolutely beautifully artistically done pieces that are also utilitarian. The other thing I wanted to mention about hunting is that some places, and I did say some places they're living year round, as sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic. In other places, they're much more mobile, as hunter gatherer groups tend to be. And so I imagine groups that were focused on reindeer in the north. So back in the late Pleistocene, the English Channel is actually land, and there is a big river called the Channel River that flows in there, and it's fed by the Thames, and it's fed by the Rhine, and it's fed by the Seine, and in that area, we have evidence for reindeer hunters who are probably focused on migratory reindeer. I suspect the reindeer were migratory in that region just based on the ecology, and they probably um, hunted these reindeer at certain times of year and would focus on them as game. The last thing I might mention about sort of an innovation is that the eyed needle comes into Europe during the last glacial. It first appears, the earliest eyed needle we have is at Denisova Cave, which is a famous cave in southern Siberia, famous because it is the place at which we discovered the Denisovans, these, or Denisovans as some people say it, these humans that are a different species than we are, different species than Neanderthals, and yet interbred with both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. Doesn't surprise me that the eyed needle is invented in Siberia first. Siberia is a very continental climate, very cold in the winter, but it does become, eyed needles become an important part of the toolkit as Europe descends into what's known as the last glacial maximum, starting at about 26,000 years ago.
And when we talk about culture, we have to factor in the possibility of art and invention. Do we have any clues in the archaeological record as to their creativity?
Absolutely. So there's a region in southern Germany called the Swabian Jura or the Swabian Alps. It's the headwaters of the Danube, so southwestern Germany. And there's some sites there. Hohlfels is one of them, and Geisenklostele. These are two sites pretty close to each other where they found ancient flutes. And the flutes are at least 35,000 years old and could be a fair amount older than that. So two of the flutes are made from the radii, so the arm bone, that thin bone. One is a swan radius, and the other one is a kind of vulture radius. And as you can imagine, bird bones are kind of light, and they're going to be hollow, as bones tend to be, long bones in particular. And so there are guidelines that have been carved into these flutes to sort of tell the maker or mark out where the holes need to be positioned. So these are the earliest musical instruments that are undisputed musical instruments. There is a potential Neanderthal flute from Slovenia that was found, I believe, in the 90s that some people suggest is just a carnivore damaged bone. So there's two of them that are made with these bird radii. And then there's one that's made from ivory. And that has to be a bit of a challenge because you have to basically cut the thing in half, hollow it out, drill the holes, and then somehow glue it back together because ivory, unlike long bones, is not hollow. So we have 35,000 plus years ago with these early modern humans in southern Germany, we have evidence of music. There's also evidence of, in that same region, little figurines, little animal figurines that were created. Some people say they're totems. I mean, they could be toys for children. Some of them aren't recognizable as to species, but many of them are. There's mammoths, what appear to be cave lions. Um, there's small, starting about 31,000 years ago, we end up with these, what are called Venus figurines. These Venus figurines happen to have a cast of the Dolny Vestanica Venus figurine here. Um, what are they? Some people have interpreted them as Earth Mother. Some people have interpreted them as fertility symbols. Some people have interpreted them as women creating sculptures of their own bodies. And some people have referred to them as paleo porn. We don't know. This is perhaps one of the earliest fired clay art objects in the world, about 31,000 years old. And she does have very pronounced secondary sexual characteristics, just slits for eyes, if you can see. These things, these Venus figurines, and I know that's an unfortunate moniker, but that's what they're called. They're found for almost 10,000 years from France in the west all the way out to Lake Baikal in Siberia in the east. And they're popular for about 10,000 years. So in the book, I refer to them as the first fad. And of course, we have cave art as well that appears during this time period. The cave art is magnificent. They use certain tricks, like they'll scrape the wall before making the painting, so that creates a whiter surface, so that they can have more contrast and color. They'll use the actual contours of the cave wall to suggest the shapes of animals, which gives them a more three-dimensional quality. And they also use vanishing point perspective. So they're beautiful artwork. And of course, as I say in my book, I don't know that we can define what the purpose of art is in our culture today. So I don't think I'm going to go saying what the purpose of art was tens of thousands of years ago, but it's breathtakingly beautiful stuff. So these are very creative, very artistic people.
In your book, you go into detail about a topic of great fascination to many people, the interaction between Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals. We now know that these two groups interbred, but what else does modern research tell us about the interactions that these species had?
I mean, this is the $1,000,000 question, right? This is what you want to go back in time and see, our interactions between Neanderthals and early modern humans. So when in 2010, when they announced that the Neanderthal genome had been sequenced and there was evidence that Neanderthals had contributed genes to Homo sapiens, genes that are still present among people today and most people around the world, that to me still is an amazing discovery. And it still kind of thrills me to think about it over a decade later. But in that initial publication, they suggested that the interbreeding events, which may have been few, were centered in, say, Western Asia or the Levant, that eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And so the question still remains, how much interaction was there in Europe? And, the genetic data these days, there've been some finds. Bachokiro, which is a site in Bulgaria, it's about 46,000 years old. You have some individuals there who have relatively recent Neanderthal ancestry. And so you could say, well, where is that ancestry taking place? They're pretty close to what we now call Asia. So Europe is a possibility, but Western Asia is also a possibility. There's a site in Romania called Awaza where we have an individual who's about 38,000 years old, give or take a couple thousand years. And this individual had such recent Neanderthal ancestry that it's possible there was a great great grandparent who was a Neanderthal. That individual actually has the highest proportion of Neanderthal genes ever documented in a Homo sapiens individual, this 38,000-year-old individual from Mawaza. It's somewhere around 6 to 9% Neanderthal genes. Around the world today, it's about 1.5 to 2% Neanderthal genes is about what you see on average. I know that mine is about 1.3% Neanderthal, so it's a little less than the global average. I was kind of hoping when I did the genetic test that I'd have this really high average because that would make a great story. Man who studies Pleistocene humans has highest amount of Neanderthal genes on record. As I say in the book, ours is an imperfect universe. So we do have. Oh, and also there's a site called Zlatý Kun, which is in the Czech Republic. Hard to date this specimen. The specimen was dug out in the 1950s, and there was a sort of glue, organic-based glue, probably horse-based glue, that has impregnated it to the point that one can't get a good solid date on it. But they were able to extract DNA from it that suggested it too had a fairly recent Neanderthal ancestry. So, or at least ancestor. It's an anatomically modern human, what I would call in the book Cro-Magnon, but it has some relatively recent Neanderthal genetic input into it. Now, here's the tricky part: is trying to document this archaeologically, and it's fun because stuff is coming out all the time. So there was just something in the last couple of weeks that's come out about this. So it's a shifting landscape. There's all sorts of things that are changing. But what we try to find, or what we'd like to know, is who is responsible for what archaeologically is known as the initial Upper Paleolithic. So the initial Upper Paleolithic, or IUP, is a set of industries or tool kits that are found from Europe all the way again out to the east to Mongolia. They date from roughly, say, 60,000 years ago, maybe at the earliest, to about 40,000 years ago. And they have things like art objects in them, pierced teeth, pierced shells. They have a lot of tools that are made on blades. So archaeologically, one definition of a blade is something that's at least twice as long as it is wide. And then the mystery, the great mystery, has always been who is responsible for these IUP industries. And it's a tough call. So back in the 90s, when I was, a young professor, there were 3 sites in southwest France and in northern Spain, no, 4 sites, where there were said to have been shifting layers between one of these IUP industries, this initial Upper Paleolithic industry, called the Château-Perronian. So the Château-Perronian is found in southwest, south central France on into sort of northern Spain. And it's the sort of distinctive feature of the Château-Perronian is something called a Château-Perron blade. It's a blade. It's a backed bladelet. Maybe a projectile weapon in some cases. It's hard to know for sure. And there are pierced beads associated with it, pierced shell, pierced teeth, like the canines of red deer, for example, are frequently pierced. And then it was just assumed early on that this IUP, this Château-Perronian industry, was made by modern humans, because that was the old idea, is that modern humans come into Europe with this Upper Paleolithic technology. The Neanderthals that were there had only been associated with Mousterian or Middle Paleolithic technology, not focused on blades, very little evidence for art. And then in 1979, at a site called Saint-Césaire in southwestern France, there was a Neanderthal specimen that was said to have been recovered from Château-Perronian levels. So the Château-Perronian people were saying, well, maybe this Upper Paleolithic industry, this IUP, is actually manufactured by Neanderthals. And in my book, even, I say that the only remains associated, human remains, associated with the Chalcopyronian are Neanderthal remains. So there's a series of sites near Arcis-sur-Gueux in the sort of the center of France where Neanderthal remains are associated with the Chalcopyronian. And then we have Saint-Césaire. And so it became this idea that maybe the Chalcopyronian is made by Neanderthals, and then there's another industry that's not considered an initial Upper Paleolithic industry, another industry called the Aurignacian that appears to have been solely the work of modern humans. And at these 4 sites that I mentioned, there were said to be interdigitations of Chalcopyronian and then Aurignacian and then Chalcopyronian again. I call this the timeshare view of human evolution, whereas a site, so if you imagine the Chalcopyronian is made by Neanderthals and the Aurignacian is made by modern humans, that we have these 2 species coming into the same site and using it at different times. It's a fascinating idea. Unfortunately, it's wrong. So as people started to look at the data at some of these sites, including Jean-Guillaume Bard, who's a French archaeologist who did his dissertation, I think it was in 2002, he found that at certain sites there were Chalcopyronian artifacts that were brought down by gravity onto a pristine Aurignacian layer. So this sort of notion of the Neanderthals coming in after modern humans at the same site. There was another site that he looked at, 2 sites in central France, or southwestern France, I guess I should say, where he dismissed that idea. There was a site in Spain called El Pendo, where it was shown that the entire sequence was secondarily deposited. So none of these sites where this interdigitation of what presumably Neanderthal cultural remains and Cro-Magnon or early modern human cultural remains, it just didn't hold up to closer scrutiny, which to me, another beautiful hypothesis failed by ugly fact, right? Now, there's some other issues as well. Just within the last few months, some friends of mine, French colleagues, report an iliac bone, and it's of a neonate, and it's from the Chalcopyronian layer, and it's deep within the Chalcopyronian layer. It's an early Chalcopyronian layer. That iliac bone is, when they do an analysis of its morphology, a multivariate analysis of its morphology, it's a Homo sapiens iliac bone. So there are also some people who have complained about the fact that Saint-Césaire, that Neanderthal that was originally discovered in Chalcopyronian layers, it was removed en bloc and brought to the lab to excavate. And so they're like, we're having trouble correlating where exactly that burial fits into the layers at that particular site. There's some layers that they think might not be Chalcopyronian layers, and perhaps this Neanderthal skeleton is actually from an underlying Mousterian layer. Now, the date, they do have a direct date on the Saint-Césaire skeleton, which is roughly, I think it's about 42,000 years ago. So it temporally, it sort of fits with the late Chalcopyronian. But the Chalcopyronian may not be the work of Neanderthals. And we have to be cautious about this. Dan Lieberman, who's a paleoanthropologist at Harvard, I remember years ago, he said, there's perils associating a certain technology with a certain species. He says he has a wok in his kitchen, but it doesn't establish Chinese ancestry for him. So we do have to be cautious. Who's making the other IUP? So about 2011, there's another initial Upper Paleolithic industry in southern Italy called the Evolutian, and that they found some deciduous teeth, so baby teeth associated with it, and the morphology of the baby teeth was not Neanderthal-like; it was modern human-like. So that suggested to some that the Evolutian, which is another one of these very early, about 44,000 to 40,000 year old initial Upper Paleolithic industry, was not the work of Neanderthals, but was the work of early modern humans. Some colleagues of mine have questioned that site isn't in fact mixed between what's known as proto-organization, because there are certain hallmarks of the proto-organization, which is only so far associated with Homo sapiens, that are found in this layer that's supposed to be an Evolutian layer. So that's a problem. We don't know who made the initial Upper Paleolithic industry in Italy. There's also at Bachokiro, which is a site in Bulgaria I mentioned earlier. There's some 46,000-year-old material there. When they've looked at the material and extracted DNA, they've got good dates, about 46,000 years old. It's Homo sapiens that is associated with this initial Upper Paleolithic industry at Bachokiro. One of the most exciting things that happened while I was writing my book is that at a site called Mandrin Cave in the Rhone Valley of South France, there's a site that overlooks sort of the Rhone Valley. It's a natural corridor between the Mediterranean and Europe north of the Alps. And at that site, there's an initial Upper Paleolithic industry known as the Neronian. It stands out like a sore thumb. There's Middle Paleolithic, Neanderthal associated material. There's this brief lens that's the Neronian with pierced teeth and bladelets and microblades and all sorts of interesting stuff. And then there's Middle Paleolithic material above it. And it looks like that this was an incursion of Homo sapiens into Europe about 54,000 years ago. Very brief. They're there for, archaeologically long enough for us to detect them, but it could have just been a very brief, less than a year occupation, and then they're gone. And then the Neanderthals are there for another 10,000 years. And then we see a proto-organization layer that we assume is modern humans coming back 44,000 years ago. I mean, this is exciting stuff. We have these incursions of modern humans into sort of Neanderthal country very early. It's possible there were earlier incursions still that we're not going to be able to pick up archaeologically. You have to be there long enough to leave a record for us to find it. Just super exciting. And it doesn't look like modern humans were so superior in their adaptation or in their technology to Neanderthals that they just waltzed into Europe and, within a few generations, the Neanderthals went extinct. I mean, these guys come in and then they're gone for 10,000 years and then they finally come back. And then just last week, there was another IUP industry that goes by a bunch of different names. It stretches from England, Belgium, Germany, and into Poland. And it has different names in those different countries. I'll call it the Lincolnbian because that's the one I know. This is about 45,000 years old. It's an IUP or initial Upper Paleolithic industry. Nobody knew who made it. Is it Neanderthals? Is it modern humans? And there's some modern human DNA that's been extracted from material in a very clear IUP layer. So the IUP, it's where the action is, and we don't know who's responsible for it. It could be that Neanderthals are responsible for some of it. It could be that modern humans are responsible for all of it. It's exciting, and it's a little frightening. What can we say about these interactions? I will say this: we know that they occasionally mated with each other. Obviously, I can't say whether those were violent matings or if the people were actually getting along with each other. I think given the thousands of square kilometers and the thousands of years we're talking about, we can imagine all kinds of interactions from affiliative to avoidance to outright violence in some cases. We do know that they communicate with each other. And the reason I say this with certainty is that there were studies in the last couple of years of gestures by chimpanzees and bonobos. So in the wild, chimpanzees and bonobos use gestures to communicate. And there were these studies that we humans can interpret the gestures of bonobos and chimpanzees with a greater degree of accuracy than would be expected by chance alone. So if we can interpret the gestural language of animals from which we've been split for, 7 million years and perhaps longer, then certainly that split between us and Neanderthals, which maybe at the earliest was 700,000 years ago, and perhaps as recent as 300,000 years ago, they would have been able to communicate with each other. And exactly how, difficult to say. I tend to think Neanderthals probably had a spoken language. There may have been certain vowel sounds that they couldn't produce the same as we can, but they definitely, I think, could communicate with each other.
It's amazing, Trent, how long, like the Neanderthals, they hung around, like thousands, tens of thousands of years. And we think of ancient Rome as just as such a long time ago, and it really wasn't in comparison to what they were doing.
Yeah, so there's actually a joke about that in my book, and I think it's kind of funny. It might be fun. Your viewers might find it amusing. So in 1999, I was working at that town Dolní Vesnica in the Czech Republic, and there were two American archaeologists who were there with me. There was Olga Sofer, who has retired recently, but is a Paleolithic archaeologist, and Jim Adavazio, who's most famous for finding Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania, which is one of these pre-Clovis sites that he found purely by accident. And they were working on textiles, the possibility of textiles 30,000 plus years ago at Dolní Vesnica. And then my friend Jiří Svoboda, who was the director at the time there in Dolní Vesnica, he was there as well. And we went to go see a talk in Vienna. It was I was excited. It was Jakov Radovčić, who died fairly recently, paleoanthropologist, Croatian paleoanthropologist. He was giving a talk in Vienna, and we decided we would go. And so Jiří is driving us. We're leaving early in the morning. It's not too far to Vienna. It's a couple hours away. And I remember we're driving, and it's early in the morning. I'm trying to wake up, and I look over, and there are these people doing screening. And they're clearly doing archaeology. They're up on kind of this low rise, and they're screening. And we're just kind of watching them. Everybody's kind of quiet. It's early in the morning. And Jiří says, "Oh, that's my friend's site over there." And Olga asks, she says, "What kind of site is it?" And he says, "It's a Roman fortification." And she says, "Current events."
Your book, Cro-Magnon, The Story of the Last Ice Age People of Europe, is out now and tells the incredible story of Homo sapiens, going into even greater detail than we've been able to touch upon today. Trent, why did you decide to write this book, and what do you hope people will get out of it?
So as I mentioned before, I've always been fascinated by early modern humans. I love the Neanderthals. I went to study Neanderthals, but I felt like the Neanderthals had been done to death. I mean, there's so many books about the Neanderthals, and I thought it would be fun to write a book from my perspective on early modern humans in Europe, the so-called Cro-Magnon. And no one really calls them Cro-Magnon anymore, but I wanted that in the title so that people would know this was a book about fossil humans, right? If I said something about early modern humans, historians might look at it and think, is he talking about the 16th century? Uh, People might think, "Oh, are you talking about the 1950s?" So Cro-Magnon is in the title just because it lets the reader know right off the bat that I am talking about human evolution, albeit very recent human evolution. And hopefully people will enjoy it. We've talked a lot about it, but there's a whole bunch of material packed into this book that we didn't discuss today. Both their biology, some things about their biology I didn't get to talk about, a little bit about behavior, and maybe teasing out why we're here and Neanderthals aren't. That's the $1,000,000 question. I don't think I have an answer to it, but I make a stab at it in the book as well. So when I wrote this book, I wrote it with a popular audience in mind, sort of the general readership, people who are interested in human evolution. I hope I've succeeded in making the story of these early modern humans in Europe accessible to the general reader. It is available on a lot of sort of the online outlets, Barnes and Noble. Amazon. It's available through the press, Columbia University Press, and it's been more of a hit with independent booksellers than with big chains. Apparently, it was a surprise success at the book convention, is what my editor tells me. So a lot of independent booksellers are carrying it as well. So it should be available in a bookstore near you if you don't want to order it online and you want to support a local bookstore.
Well, it's been fantastic talking to you, Trent, and no doubt people are going to be curious about your ongoing research. So, are there any new projects you can tell us about? Perhaps new field work, maybe even a new book in the works?
So I am still doing field work in France and Portugal. We have lifetimes of work that could be done in those places in terms of unexplored, especially in Portugal. Portugal doesn't have quite the history of archaeology that France does. So there are entire areas of the country where, when I talked about rock shelters being full of sediments, we have rock shelters that are untouched, just full of sediments waiting to be explored. And so I'm still actively involved with some of those research projects in France as well. In terms of my writing, the book I'm writing now is actually much farther back in time. And I'm writing a book on the origins of the genus Homo. So this book that I just wrote is on the origins of Homo sapiens. We talk about 300,000 years ago being sort of the earliest. The book I'm writing about the origins of the genus Homo, we're talking about around 3 million years ago. And so it's taking place in Africa. So I'm going to have to shift back to that African early hominin record, talk about the emergence of our genus, both from sort of a technological, behavioral, as well as a phylogenetic or ancestor descendant perspective. So I'm enjoying the idea of writing it. I've got an outline. I've started working on some of the early chapters, and hopefully I'll be able to finish it in a timely fashion. But look, Mark, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for letting me pontificate about my work and about my book. It's been a really fun conversation. I do appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Trenton Holiday, thank you very much indeed.